Hey class. This is our second video for this week. I'm gonna do a quick intro to Adobe Illustrator, which is our second program that we're learning this semester. And we're gonna use this along with Photoshop to create our first project, which is our self-portrait. And for that self-portrait, we're gonna be doing two different images. So we have the Photoshop one that we're working on, which is a composite of source images. And now we're gonna start working on an Illustrator one that is more of an illustration or a design or logo or something like that. So in this one, I'm just going to go over the basics, setting up Illustrator, using some of the basic tools, and then exporting an image at the end. And then at the very end, I'll go over posting our second progress blog on the OpenLab blog. So let's go over and let's take a look at where we are in our digital imaging section. So this is from last week. We had a few videos with Photoshop. There's a bunch of links here to tutorials and other resources for both Photoshop and Illustrator. So if you want to review stuff, take a look at these. And down here is the assignment. So let's just look at this real quick. So ultimately what we're going to be turning in a couple weeks is a image that was generated in Photoshop, an image that was generated in Illustrator, a short statement about the project, credits for all of the images that were used specifically for Photoshop, although you could use images in Illustrator if you wanted to. That's all going to go on the OpenLab, and then on Blackboard, we're going to submit our original Photoshop file, our Illustrator file, and a link to the OpenLab post. I'll go over all of that next week, but for now, let's just jump into Illustrator because we haven't used it yet, and we're just going to learn some basics. We'll start creating a very simple image. You can see I made this very sort of quick, goofy logo for the class. I'll kind of go over some things like that in the video today. And then next week, we'll go over a couple more cool effects that we can do with Illustrator and then submitting the assignment. So I'm gonna go over to Illustrator. I already have it open because sometimes it can take a little while to open. But there it is. When you open it, you're gonna see something that looks like this. You may see another window that will look, I think, like this, with some tutorials and different things, which of course you're welcome to take a look at. And you know, there's a bunch of other tutorials that are actually built into Illustrator having to do with all the tools and stuff like that, as well as Photoshop. Anyway, let's just get started. So we're gonna go over setting up our document first. Actually, let's write down what we're doing. So for Illustrator, let's just delete our Photoshop. So we're working with Illustrator. We are going to set up our documents, go over basic tools and layers, and export an image. And finally, we're gonna post on OpenLab. Okay, so that's what we're gonna be working on. So I'm gonna go to new file here, and there's some presets here. I'm not working on a print file, so I'm gonna change the dimensions to pixels. And I'm just gonna make a square because I'm gonna work on a logo. So I'm gonna do 1024 pixels by 1024 pixels, one of our powers of 2. And then all this other stuff we can leave default. I'm gonna click create, and it's gonna create my image for me. And so you can see there's a lot of similarities between Photoshop and Illustrator. Obviously, they're made by the same company, and the basic layout is very similar. Our tools are over here. Our properties and layers are over here. We're gonna have the layers open a lot. I'm actually gonna put my layers over here just so we can have both of those open, although having the properties open can be useful. And so Illustrator uses a lot of the same concepts as Photoshop, but it's vector-based. So remember in our digital imaging lecture, we talked about the difference between raster and vector. And although both of the programs can work with both types of images, Illustrator is really more about creating vector graphics, which is a combination of points and fills and strokes that connect the points. So we'll use some of the tools to go over the basics for that. So yeah, we'll get started with that. I'm gonna move into this view so we can just focus on Illustrator. There are a bunch of little pop-ups and things asking us to do stuff that we don't need to do. So let's get rid of these. I'm just gonna actually undock this altogether. So we have my layers here. Illustrator layers work a little bit differently. They are similar in some ways. I'm going to go ahead and save this. One thing that you might see if you're using the cloud is this save in the Creative Cloud. You're welcome to do that. I think it's fine for what we're using in this class, but I prefer to save things on my computer so I can find things easily. It's definitely going to make it easier when you turn things in. Actually, that's a good reason not to save on the cloud, because you're going to have to turn this in eventually, and you need to know where the file is to be able to do that. So what I would do here is click Save on your computer. This will bring up our drop-down window for either Mac or Windows, depending on what you're on. And we can go ahead and save this in the same folder as our Photoshop self-portrait. We can even call it Photoshop, or we can even call it self-portrait rather, because there are different file types. So our computer is not going to be bothered by that. So I'll call this self-portrait.ai, and AI stands for Adobe Illustrator. You can leave all of the defaults the same. So I'll just hit OK. So a couple things to go over with the Illustrator interface that might be useful. One thing that can be hard to figure out is if you want to actually change the size of the document, how do you do that? And the way that you do that, I actually usually just hit Shift-O, and that brings up this thing called the Artboard, and you can resize it here. So it brings up these little squares, and I can resize them here. You probably won't need to do that, but some people get confused about that because it's different than Photoshop. If I want to get out of here, I can just use one of my regular tools, or I can hit V on the keyboard to get my selection arrow. With the layers, I can, a couple other things that are useful for doing like very organized and specific designs is there's a bunch of stuff under View that can be really useful. You can show a grid, and then you can also turn on Snap to Grid. And so let's see what that looks like real quick. So if I say Show Grid, you're going to see this grid like this. And if I add an object, I'm just going to add a rectangle. If I don't have Snap turned on, notice that I can just kind of like draw this rectangle around. It doesn't really care that much. However, if I go back to View and I turn Snap to Grid on, now when I try to draw a rectangle, it's kind of hard to see because my grid units are very small, but if you try this on your own, you'll start to feel that it's not letting me put it anywhere. It's snapping to these tiny little sections. So actually, maybe I'll zoom in and you'll see what I mean. So notice that it's kind of like growing in increments. It's growing a little bit at a time as I move my mouse around. And so that's basically what Snap does. And it makes it really easy to make designs that use very, consistent sizing and spacing. So I can really easily make this kind of like box design where everything is lined up very nicely. So Illustrator is really good for that. Again, you can do that in Photoshop, but Illustrator is really more where you might want to do that type of thing. You can also snap to pixel. I don't usually turn this on. And then you can change the grid. To change the grid, we need to go to, let's see. Maybe we need to go over here, settings, guides and grid. So again, that was Illustrator, settings, guides, and grid. So if you want, you can see a grid line is every 72 pixels. We could change that to 64, and we could say 8 for the subdivisions. And now we'll have a much simpler grid. So it just kind of depends on what you're trying to make, how big it is, how much data you want in there. I'm going to turn this off because I'm not going to try to make something very, very accurate, but you might want to use it. It's really up to you. Okay, so now there we go. I can also turn a ruler on and off by hitting Command R. So you can just see where you are on your pixels. Again, this is useful if you're trying to make something very exact and accurate, but it's not really necessary. Okay, so we've got a bunch of tools here. Most of the time when I'm working in Illustrator, I'm using these shape tools. But before we go to the shape tools, let's look at a couple other tools. So you have a brush. This is sort of like in Photoshop. You can draw and paint around and you can create this thing. But instead of drawing pixels onto the screen, if we zoom in, and I'm going to hit V and click on this, notice what we're actually drawing are these points and these colors. So the other thing that's different about Illustrator is there's two different arrow selectors. So one, this top one is selection. So you select an entire object. And once I select it, I can move it around, and it kind of sees my different strokes as different objects. The other one, the filled in one, is direct selection. And this will select points in the stroke, and then I can move this point around. And if it's curved, I'm also going to see this little anchor, and I can change this curve. So because Illustrator is for illustration, we have a lot more control over these brush strokes and shapes that we use, so we can really refine them to make them exactly the way we want them. I can I can hit A to get the direct selection tool, and then sometimes it's a little tricky. Sometimes I end up selecting the whole thing. So if that happens, just click somewhere else where there's nothing there, and just try clicking again. And you can see anywhere there's a point along this line, I can actually move that point and change that around. So that can be a lot of fun. It also adds a layer of complexity and can be kind of challenging. So that's the brush tool. Another thing that we can do once I select one of these things, let's look in our layers panel. So each one of these little strokes is called a path, and I can turn them on and off individually, just like in Photoshop, or I can turn on and off my whole layer. And I can name this layer by double clicking and saying brush strokes. And so now I can move that around, and I can make more layers. If I want to, do some shapes, I can draw this layer down here and call this shapes. And I can move things between layers. So for example, I can take this path and I can drag it down here. We don't necessarily need to do all these things, but just kind of showing some of the options. But let's grab a stroke, and then let's see what we can kind of change about it. So I'm going to go over to the properties section over here. And so for each one of our strokes, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. We have a color for the stroke. And so if I change this color, you're going to see the color changes. And then there's also a weight to the stroke. So if I choose a different weight, then the stroke gets thicker. And I can increase like that or decrease like that. I can also change the opacity of the entire thing if I want to. And then I can also set a fill. So if I set a fill, it's going to look weird on these brush strokes because it doesn't have like a full shape. So that'll make more sense with our basic shapes. And if I want to turn that off, I just click on that again and click this little red X, and we'll get rid of that fill. So let's hide this, and I'll make some shapes that will demonstrate this a little more clearly. Here's my contextual menu again, which is a new thing in the Adobe products that's really honestly geared towards generative AI stuff, which is cool, but not what we're learning in the class. So I'm just going to get rid of this for now. Okay, so let's leave our brushstrokes there. Let's look at some shapes, and then we'll also look at the pen tool after that. So I'm going to go here. Here's my rectangle. I'll just draw a nice little rectangle. This will be my background. And so again, this has a fill by default. But we can, it has a stroke, which is the outline, but it also can just be a color. So let's set that to a fill, and then we can turn off the stroke. And now we just have this sort of like block of color, and we can move this around. And just like our path, if I use the direct selection tool, so if I hit A on the keyboard, I can select one of these points and move it around. Although you do have to be careful, because sometimes you select the whole thing. But if I select one of these points, I can move it around. Notice this point isn't rounded. This is just like a sharp angle. And we can change that if we want to. But with our square shape or our rectangle shape, that's kind of the default. Another thing that is nice with this rectangle, if I zoom in a little bit, and then I'm hitting space to drag over, there's this little circle right here, and if I drag this, this makes a rounded rectangle. And that makes things a little bit more complicated, but notice that it adds in these little handles that we saw before, where we can kind of control this like curve. So that can be really useful, and I can make a little rounded rectangle if I want to. I want to change the color, let's see. I'm just kind of clicking on these default colors, but if we want a more specific color, you can go to the color mixer, and I can choose different colors. Get like a lighter, that one's kind of nice. Okay, so then if I want, I can select the whole thing. So I'm just dragging my mouse across the entire box. I moved it by accident. You do have to be very careful. You'll get used to it, but at first Illustrator can be a little tricky. Now I want to round my rectangle. So if I select the entire box, now I can round my rectangles and I can, or sorry, my corners, and now I can round them all at the same time. So I can round them individually if I want, but I have to click outside to make sure I'm not selecting everything. Oh, I'm using the wrong arrow. I also do that a lot. I forget to switch arrows. Now I have to click outside. You'll get used to this eventually, but let's see. Can I get this? Okay. Maybe I can't do this on its own. Okay. I guess it's like locked in. Maybe I was always doing all of them. I don't know. Anyway, so we can round our corners if we want to. And we can do this with all of our shapes. And we'll add a couple more shapes. One other thing that we can do. So now that I have this shape, if I select it with the main selection tool, you're going to see these boxes around the edge. And you can use this to resize. And if you kind of hover a little bit outside of the box, you can rotate around. And if you go here, you can, resize this way. And with all of these, if I start rotating or resizing and I hold shift, it's gonna kind of lock it to certain positions. So I can't smoothly rotate it, but if I hold shift, it's gonna lock it into different positions so you can get more specific rotations. So let's undo those transforms. And so we have our little box. And let's add a couple more shapes. So I'm gonna save this and I'm gonna go to the ellipse tool and let's add a couple circles. So I'll draw a circle here. Notice that if the circle is the same color, I can't see the difference between the two. So let's change the fill here. Let's do like a yellow. It's kind of cool. Okay, so now we've got a yellow circle. Another thing that's really useful if I'm working with a lot of shapes is if I hold the Alt or Option key and click on a circle, I can duplicate it really easily. So I can make a bunch of circles and make this little yellow sort of cloud inside of my green square. And so now I've got all these little circles, and here's another thing that's really useful in Illustrator. If I click on one of these and move it, oh, I don't want to move the background. Okay, so one thing you can do in Illustrator first is you can lock stuff, just like in Photoshop. So if I click this button next to the eyeball, it's in a slightly different place. If I click this, now the background is locked, I can't move it. Okay, so now if I try to move one of these circles, it's only going to move by itself. But what if I want to move all of them? I could drag over all of them and move them around, but I might forget to do that. So if I want this to be its own thing, I can select everything, and then you can group them. So I'm going to try to remember where to find groups. So I'm going to go to Help and type in Group, and it's under the Object menu, or you can just hit Command G. So I'm going to go to Object and Group. So look, now it collapsed all of these layers into a separate layer by itself. And now if I click on this, any one of them, even though it still shows me the geometry inside of here, if I click on this and move it around, it's going to move everything together. And I can scale and resize everything. And I can grab this whole group and move it behind the rectangle and the layers, and it'll do that for me. And I can move it around like that. So grouping stuff, if you have like one kind of component, you can make groups inside of your layers that'll make it easier to move that component around. So now it sort of looks like I'm creating like a person with, sort of blonde hair. So not really a self-portrait. I don't have blonde hair, but if I wanted to change that, I could grab these guys. So I can double click into the group and select everything. And let's change the color. So I'll click on the fill and let's do some nice blue hair. Okay, there we go. And now I'll just go out and there we go. We changed everything all together. Okay, so those are some circles. Let's see what other shapes we have. The Polygon tool is useful. You can make different polygons with different numbers of sides. So this little button right here, which shows the plus minus, is going to add or subtract sides. Actually, let me zoom out. So if I move, let's lock down my hair group. Okay, So if I grab this and I add or subtract more sides, obviously 3 sides is a triangle, 4 sides is a square, but then we add more and more sides. So let's do 7 sides. It's kind of weird. You don't see a lot of designs with 7 sides. And so now if I hit Option, I can duplicate this. Although I seem to be stuck somewhere. I get stuck in Illustrator a lot. Let's try. Not letting me. There we go. I don't know why I was stuck, but now I can move this. So let's hold Alt Option and give my self-portrait another eyeball. And maybe we'll actually do a different number of sides. That'll be kind of funny. Okay. So we've got 2 eyes, we've got some hair, we've got some different numbers of sides. And let's see, we also have the star tool. This just makes a star. It's pretty much exactly what it does. Maybe I'll shrink this. Maybe I'll transform this and use it as a weird mouth. Okay. So yeah, it's just a star tool. One thing I can do though with this is I think if I expand this, now it'll just, yeah, now it's not gonna be kind of stuck as a star tool, so I can kind of squish it and do different stuff with it. So sometimes if you have a shape and you just want points, you can click expand and it'll just turn it into a separate thing. Okay. So now I've got kind of a weird mouth, so that's kind of fun. I've got this weird kind of self-portrait going on. I think that's all of our shapes. Oh, there's a line segment tool, but that's not very exciting. Let's skip that. So there's one more tool that's really useful, which is the pen tool. And there's actually 2 types of pen tools. There's the regular pen, and then there's the curved pen tool. So let's use the regular pen. I'm gonna click on that. I'm gonna turn off the fill because it's a pen stroke, and I'm gonna choose a stroke. I'm gonna let's choose a color. Let's do a brighter green. I think that'll look good. What we've got so far, something like that. And let's increase the stroke a little bit. And so what you're gonna see with the pen tool is I'm just gonna add points, and it's gonna let me add these points. And then if I wanna connect them, I can, and I can kind of make this shape. I didn't make the color different enough, so let's try a different color. There we go, and let's increase the stroke even more. Okay, so I can make this kind of weird shape, and if I zoom in, you can kind of see the geometry here, and if I take the direct selection tool, I can move stuff around, I can round stuff off, I can do all sorts of different stuff with this. And it just kind of, you know, is some geometry, it's some points. And I can make this kind of like little nose thing. You know, I can play around with this and find the right sort of proportions. Sometimes it lets me round if I have enough space. Sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, I can kind of get kind of an interesting thing with that. I can also change this into a fill. So let's do a fill. Let's click on that button and that'll just turn the stroke into the fill. And so now I have this new shape. So that's the pen tool. It can be kind of tricky to use. I'm gonna delete this. So I just hit backspace. I'm gonna show you guys again. So just start by clicking and you click around and you can just kind of do whatever you want. One tricky thing, I ended it by clicking back at the beginning, but you don't have to do that. If you just want to end, you can just hit enter and that'll just end your stroke there. And so you can start a new one over here and you can just hit enter. So you can make as many of these as you want and, you know, kind of end them where you want to, and they'll just be open rather than closed. Okay, one more is the curvature pen tool. This just adds curves by default. So if you want to make nice curvy, loopy shapes, you can do that with the curvature tool. And then we can edit these points again. And this just kind of adds curves by default as opposed to kind of adding them in yourself later. And I'm still having trouble selecting just one anchor point. There we go. Oops, that's not the one I want. Let's go with this. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's actually make this. Let's just fill this like the rest of everything. So I can click on the fill here and should be able to. Okay, there we go. Let's use our color picker. Oh, actually, in this one, it doesn't automatically come up. I have to choose a color picker from the tools over here. Okay, so those are kind of our main tools. There's a bunch of other stuff we can do in Illustrator. I will go over a few of those things in the next video, some more kind of advanced stuff we can do. For now, with the Illustrator self-portrait, you can really just like start from scratch and just create something, create a design or an illustration that either looks like you or looks like something that you want to represent. We're not gonna start with a source image like you would in Photoshop, but you could add an image here and trace over it or do some fun things like that. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to export an image because there are a couple different settings that we want to go over. Another thing that I'll do real quick, I'm going to select everything for a second. So I'm going to unlock these guys. I'm going to select everything. Something that might be useful if I want to just make this nice and lined up, I can go to Window and go to Align. And I have some options here where I can center. Whoops, I unselected everything. Okay, select everything and then I'm going to, whoops. Gonna center, no, okay. I guess I just have to, maybe I have to group everything. If I group this, now can I center? Yeah, there we go. So I can center in the middle of the self-portrait. Okay, so that looks good. And then if I want to ungroup, I can just click on that group and hit Command-Shift-G, or no, that's not it. Let's look under Object. Oh, there's no ungroup. Let's look up ungroup. Okay, so where is ungroup? Oh, it doesn't give me the option. Okay, so maybe I just hit here. I have to select it. And there's ungroup. So it is Command-Shift-G, I just didn't have it selected. So then we can ungroup now that we're aligned, and we can do some more editing, and then do whatever we want later. Okay, so let's export an image because there's a couple things that we have to kind of look out for in Illustrator. So I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to go to Export As, and so far it looks the same, but it's going to bring up our menu first, and then it's going to bring up some settings second. Okay, so for Illustrator, we have a bunch of different image settings that we can use. We're going to go with PNG. JPEG would actually be appropriate for this as well, but I'll show you why we're going to use PNG in just a second. The other thing that we have to look at here is this thing that says use artboards. Essentially what that's going to do, notice that we have this like white background. If we click use artboards, it's going to use the size of that white background for our final image. If we don't click that, it's actually going to crop into just the actual illustration itself. So let's uncheck it first. I'll show you what that looks like. And I'm going to click export. Then we have some PNG options. We don't want to change anything up there, but then notice the preview right here. See, the image is very small. Let's see if I can make this window bigger. Can't, okay. The image is very small, and then you see it's kind of transparent. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to dismiss this, and I'm going to go back over to the Finder. And so now here is the exported version of the self-portrait. And so notice it doesn't have a white background, and it's also cropped in. So if you just want just the art with nothing else, this is good. This is going to be what you want. If you want it to be as large as the original thing, then you need to use the artboard. So let's try that again. Let's go to File, Export As, and this time I'm going to click Use Artboards, and I'm going to click Export and Replace. And we're still going to keep the background transparent, so we're going to say OK. And so now we have the image, but the thing that's nice about this is we know what size it is. It's not cropped in at all. It's not shrinking stuff, but it is still transparent in the background, so we don't have that white background. So one last thing, if I wanted to do a JPEG, that would be fine, but it's going to look different. So if I click Export As and I choose JPEG, like we did with Photoshop, I'll select Use Artboards and click Export. There's no transparency option. So if I just click OK here and I go back to the Finder, notice my new self-portrait.jpg, it has this kind of like white background versus self-portrait.png. It's hard to tell in the Finder, but let's post those on OpenLab and you'll see what it looks like. Okay, so very last thing, we're gonna make a new post, and this is just updating our progress for the week on OpenLab, so this isn't our final version of this yet. So I'm gonna go back to the browser, and I've got the OpenLab page open. I'm gonna go to the plus and say new post. And so we're gonna say self-portrait progress week 2. I guess I don't need to capitalize progress here. It wants me to select a category, so I'm going to go to categories and say weekly blog post. And I'm going to say this week I added some filters in my Photoshop project and got started with my Illustrator self-portrait. Okay, so let's add some images. I'm gonna click the plus and go to image, and I'm gonna click upload, and I'm gonna go into my documents and find the self-portrait. And so I'm gonna start with my second version of my Photoshop self-portrait. So that looks fine. And then I'm just gonna click out here and add a new image. And I'm gonna upload a couple versions of my Illustrator self-portrait just to show the difference. So here's the JPEG and here's the PNG. It's actually not letting me select them both. I'll just do one at a time. Okay, there's the JPEG. Notice the white background. And then here is the PNG, which supports transparency. So notice there's no white background. So either one is fine. It really just depends on what look you're going for, but I kind of like this nice no background look. So I'm gonna delete this version. And so there's my Illustrator self-portrait. Okay, so that's basically it for this week. Again, you don't have to submit this on Blackboard. When you post this, I'm gonna get a notification and I'll see it and mark it down. And that's gonna be part of your participation grade at the end of the semester. But you know, if you have any questions or wanna go over anything, we can meet in office hours or email or chat on Discord, whatever you prefer. If you want to talk more about your process or things that you're considering or thinking about for the self-portrait, feel free to add more here. But for now, I'm going to just preview, make sure this looks okay. And there we go, looks pretty good. So then whoops, okay. I think my mouse is acting weird. It's not always clicking. Anyway, let's go ahead and publish this, and that'll be our week 2 blog. So we can click view post, and there we go. So again, just a quickly reminder, if I click on my name, the nice thing about the blog is we will see our projects as we post them. So that'll be nice to see. And you can also click on the weekly blog post, and you'll see everybody's work as they're working on things. And that'll be great. I also will make a quick video on Monday where I'm just gonna take a look at what you guys have been working on, and I'll talk about it a little bit just to give you guys some feedback. I'll post that as an unlisted video, so it won't be publicly available, but I'll add that on Monday. So yeah, that's it for this week. Let me know if you have any questions. And next week, we're going to go over how to turn in the first assignment, which is going to be due the following week. So yeah, hopefully, you know, we're all going to be up to speed with that. Yeah, this is it for this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.